When I was in the service, we called this a brush pass," Jonathan murmured into her ear under the cover of Bobby Darin. They swayed as Bobby crooned about dream lovers and long lonely nights. One of Jonathan's hands was currently slipping a slim chrome smartphone into the pocket of her voluminous skirt and taking the opportunity to pat her leg while he was at it. Faye bit back a yelp, then turned her head, shifted a laugh into a cough. "Keep your hands to yourself," she ordered, but she was smiling, and she allowed the arm she'd lifted around his shoulder to tighten just the smallest bit. She'd risk it, just for a moment. Jonathan responded with a lift of his brows, then turned her around so rapidly she felt quite breathless. Leaving her cell in his apartment before was an error she blamed solely on the romance of the weekend. Jonathan had managed to combine all of her favorite things all in one evening. Fresh flowers, fragrant tea, simple but delicious food. Overcome, she'd relaxed. She'd gotten sloppy. Faye wouldn't do that again. She couldn't afford it. But for now, she'd enjoy this moment swaying in her secret boyfriend's arms, pretending just for a moment that things were different. As if he read her thoughts, Jonathan's arms tightened around her ever so slightly. "You look nice." He'd better damn well think so. She suppressed a smile. She'd spent that morning standing shivering and irritated in her bedroom, staring at the array of color and fabric draped over every given surface. Over 10 years in the entertainment business had given her a wardrobe to fit nearly every occasion, and somewhere in that pile of dresses, she needed to find one that would cast her in a flattering night next to the ubiquitous Amelia Gray. She'd sucked in her cheeks and waffled between a simple column in gunmetal with black lace trim and a strapless Carolyn Bessette-era cream silk before throwing both down in disgust. Who was this insecure, whiny creature that had taken over her body? She showered with water as hot as she could stand and stared herself down in the mirror. Her cheeks burned pink and her eyes shone ice blue. At least she thought disparagingly jealousy had made her rather pretty. Faye had cast aside the dresses and encased herself in the vintage gown of deep jewel green, a gift from an up-and-coming Instagrammer who'd had it hemmed too short. Emerald earrings completed the look, and she styled her pixie smooth and sleek flat and shining against her head, allowing her eyes to take center stage. This evening, they burned with a brightness that seemed nearly unnatural. She wrapped herself in a tattered velvet coat that had been her grandmother's. It was the only relic of the life she'd left behind, and in one final act of rebellion, took the subway to the event. "When is this going to stop, Faye?" he asked, his voice quiet in her ear, breaking into her thoughts. Faye's stomach tightened. Jonathan hadn't brought this up in quite some time, and she'd been having so much fun this weekend. Why did he have to bring it up now? "Stop what?" she countered breezily. He laughed, but it was more rueful than amused. "Faye, last week you climbed down my fire escape in the middle of an ice storm. You had photographers parked out front. And the week before you switched places with my secretary and nearly crashed her Subaru. I haven't driven stick shift in years. And today, you have me passing you your phone on the dance floor as if—" His voice trailed off. "We're both single, Faye. I'm not married or anything, and I wouldn't be seeing you if I were." Faye's stomach tightened so hard it hurt. Married men, especially married men who lied, were a sore point with her. No, he wasn't married, and with the level of digging she'd done when this started, she definitely would have known if he was. Not that Jonathan was even capable of that type of deceit. It wasn't fair to make him pay, even in her head, for her own stupidity when it came to her past love life. Maybe I want to keep you to myself for a while without sharing you with Amelia Gray, she said lightly. Faye. His voice was reproachful. She sighed and shifted her weight as his hand guided her gently into a turn. They were skimming over the dance floor now, light as froth. Everything Jonathan did seemed light and easy. Prince Charming, Super Boy Scout, Captain America. The nicknames the press gave this kind, confident man were disconcertingly accurate. And more than once, she'd wondered how on earth. Faye blinked, glanced around, and dared only for a split second to lift her hand to his cheek. The skin was warm, or perhaps her own was cool. The band leader hit the final note with a flourish that had the entire room applauding, and Faye felt a lump rise in her throat. Jonathan hadn't released her, not yet. He peered down at her face, and his own softened. Hey, he said. Are you all right? Oh, she hated it when men asked that. Did anyone who is all right cry in public? Weddings, she mumbled and tugged away from him. He released her immediately and turned to face where Alexander and Alicia were kissing softly on a rotating platform covered with candles that shrouded them in soft, warm light. Let's take a walk, he said gently into her ear. No, you're here with the date. She hadn't intended for it to sound so bitter, not at all, and she could have kicked herself for saying it after. Jonathan muttered something under his breath that sounded very much like swearing. Then, to her horror, he reached out, plucked her phone from her hand, and headed in the opposite direction, his long legs quickly eating up the plush carpet. Damn it! Faye picked up her full skirt and took off after him. Jonathan! He waved her phone above his head and picked up the pace. This is childish. No answer. Faye's pursuit led her down one corridor and up another one, and she realized belatedly that they were alone before he turned around, and she nearly crashed into him head-on. Jonathan! She huffed, placing her hands on her hips and trying to catch her breath. Damn those stilettos. You have a lot of nerve. Faye, he said, and shook his head, and then he leaned in and kissed her. Jonathan's kiss wasn't like any she'd ever had before from him. Its intensity met her anger and culminated in something that was overwhelming, all-encompassing. She felt herself soften for him as easily as a wax seal might for a brand. He was imprinted on her skin, on all of her. She was vaguely aware of her beaded clutch dropping uselessly to the floor, her arms lifting to draw him closer. Jonathan was whispering against her ear, slow and hot things that made her close her eyes tight, grip onto him for dear life. Try her best not to tremble. He parted from her after a moment, took a moment to catch his breath. He looks a mess, Faye thought distractedly. His hair looked like it had been in a gale, and her lipstick was smeared all over his mouth. She reached out with an unsteady hand to right it, but he shook his head. Later, he said crisply. Faye, I want you to talk. About what? It was BS, and they both knew it. She bit her lower lip hard to keep it from wobbling. His face softened, and he bent and kissed her again, barely a brush of contact this time. You can trust me, he said simply when he pulled away. Faye swallowed hard. That was the problem, she couldn't trust anyone. Good intentions meant nothing. Love was set up to fail. But the way that Jonathan was looking at her right now, I trust you, she said in a small voice. But she couldn't tell him. She couldn't tell him how much she'd ached for him in their days apart, or how she'd burned with jealousy when she saw him place a hand on Amelia's arm earlier. But she did reach up place her hands on either side of his face, closed her eyes, and gave him a kiss of her own. Soft, loving, and honestly, the most intimate thing she'd ever done since they'd started this affair months ago. When she pulled back, his eyes had a suspicious dampness in them, one that she refused to believe. A man moved to so much emotion over her. Still, she'd said she trusted him, and she meant it. Trusting meant speaking no matter what came off it, because she cared enough for the other person to risk the ultimate. Trouble was, "I don't know how to do this," she said. This meant so many things, but she read in Jonathan's eyes that he recognized, identified each one. He opened his mouth, but she placed a finger over his lips. "I can't be who you want," she said, "because that means falling in love with you. And if I do that, I'm a permanent part of your life. And if I do that, I lose mine." "Faye," she shook her head. "I know this business inside out, Jonathan. The price of success is having to be what others expect. I've been there before, and it ruined everything."
"We don't have to talk about this right now, Faye."
Oh, but they did, or Faye might never have the courage again. She lifted a hand to skim the white collar that gleamed against the warm hues of his skin, then stood on tiptoe, kissed that smooth hollow at the base of his neck. "I love you so much," she whispered against his skin, and she felt his body tense with shock. It took her a moment to realize that it wasn't shock from what she'd said. It was the fact that there were now voices at the end of the corridor. She realized too late that even though guests weren't supposed to be in this part of the hotel, the press was, and they'd stumbled on the story of the week.
"Faye, you have got to calm down."
She knew she had to calm down, but there was no way in hell it was going to happen. Not after being caught kissing the most eligible bachelor in all of Lower Manhattan, quite possibly the entire East Coast. And for that matter, a bachelor who'd come to that event with another woman. "It's happening again." Faye struggled to breathe against the wave of panic that tightened her ribcage. She knew exactly what would happen next. She'd be called a boyfriend stealer, a gold-digging sleuth. "Faye." She ignored him. "Damage control," she said, and her voice was trembling, but she barged on anyway. "I need to call." "Who in God's name did you call to fix things when you were the fixer? Someone and get a plan set. We need to lie low. I need to get out of here." "Amelia said on her IG that we were attending as old school friends, Faye. That doesn't matter. Didn't Jonathan see you arrived with a woman everyone loves and got caught with another woman in some dark corner?"
"My girlfriend. I got caught with my girlfriend, Faye."
Frustration in Jonathan's voice would soon give way to anger, she could tell, but she was in no state to do anything about it.
"Why can't we just tell the truth?"
"You don't get it. You truly don't get it. This is the worst thing that possibly could happen. What that other people might know about us." Jonathan's face was dark. "You just told me you loved me. You said it." She'd argue with him, but she couldn't breathe. Jonathan's face changed from tense and frustrated to concerned, and he was by her side in a second.
"Jesus, you've gone completely white."
"I'm fine," she gasped. "No, you're not. Here, honey, grip my hands. Breathe, breathe." Faye did manage to fill her lungs with one ragged, labored breath, then let it out on a burst of tears that was the final bit of humiliation. Jonathan swore and gathered her into his arms, and for once she didn't fight it. She cried for the first time since she'd been forced to leave California, cried the same way she had all those years ago, when she'd had her heart ripped from her damaged so badly she wasn't sure it worked anymore. Jonathan had sparked it back to life in a sense, but she wasn't sure its feeble beating was enough to sustain a relationship. Jonathan did not speak, did not push her, did not force her to look at him. He just held her, cradled her as something fragile and precious, made low, comforting sounds in throat, rumbling deep to his chest. When her sobs finally reduced to manageable hiccups, and she tried to talk, he shook his head, wiped rather ineffectively at the mess on her face with his fingers.
I'll do whatever you want me to,
He said quietly.
Faye.
She turned her head. Everything ached her body, her head, her chest. The numbness she knew would come later. It always did. It doesn't matter what you do or Amelia does, she said dully. I'm screwed.
Faye?
She shook her head. Jonathan's arms were still around her, and she was too tired to leave them now to attempt to push them away. If she were honest with herself, she knew that part of her panic was tied to the fact that she'd told him she loved him. She'd told him, and he hadn't said anything up till now. I'm tired, she said, and she could barely hear herself. Jonathan nodded.
I've got a car. Let's get out of here, okay?
Faye lifted her shoulders. She had been pulled from the verge of hysteria by a man she'd told she loved, but who hadn't said it back. At this point, she barely cared where she went. Faye fell asleep exhausted on Jonathan's shoulder moments after they entered the steamy, warm refuge of a black cab, exhausted by the emotional evening. When she woke, it was to the sound of Jonathan humming softly, scrolling on his phone. She sat bolt upright, then froze. Her stomach was sour with wine, and she needed a moment to remind herself very sternly that she would not be sick. She rubbed her eyes before she remembered her mascara and swore softly under her breath. Jonathan gave her a tiny smile and passed over a pack of hand wipes.
They're necessary with all the handshaking I do,
he quipped.
Where are we?
Her voice sounded raspy and thin. She began to scrub at the offending smears under her eyes, using her phone camera as a guide. They left sad gray impressions beneath spindly lashes. She looked, she thought, as terrible as she felt.
Connecticut, heading north.
Faye stared, and he smiled, just a quick tilt of the lips. I thought it might be nice to get out of the city tonight. Faye normally would have protested at that deplorable lack of notice, but she was so tired she didn't even care. She leaned her head back on his shoulder. His closeness was comforting, as was the woodsy spice on his skin. This is going to cost you a fortune, she said after a beat.
I know, honey.
He glanced down at his watch.
Get some sleep if you want. We've got at least 2 hours left. We're just in New Haven now. Where are we going?
Rhode Island. In the dim light of the back of the car, his face was drawn and tired. I've got a house there. Were she in a normal frame of mind, there would be so much to question the fact that he hadn't asked her if she wanted to go. The fact that she hadn't any clothes, not even a toothbrush. The fact that he presumably had ditched Amelia to run away with her. She licked her lips and sat up, opened her mouth, and what came out instead surprised her. I have something to tell you, she said. I'm going to tell you everything. It'd be exactly 12 years ago this fall, when Francine Wells had arrived in California, determined to take the small screen by storm. Unlike many aspiring actresses, she knew exactly what she wanted to do: soap operas. She'd grown up watching them huddled under an electric blanket through Hoosier winters, with her General Hospital-obsessed mother and grandmother. Her natural flair for drama and connections after college had landed her a bit part on Fated Love as the half-sister of a socialite. The arc had lasted only a quarter season, but it was enough to have her pack her bags and relocate to, while not quite Hollywood, as close as she could afford to move,
convinced success was in her path. 1 year and several bedsits and minuscule studios later, Francine's portfolio was still slim, but she was the happiest she'd ever been in her life. Meeting wealthy, enigmatic playwright Gideon Franz seemed the crowning glory. She was young, pretty, and had met a man who adored her. He was a great deal like Jonathan, at least on the surface, kind, almost absent-mindedly, so indulgent, and a little old-fashioned. She thought it delightfully quaint that he refused to sleep over, planned their dates weeks in advance, favored hole-in-the-wall restaurants that no one they knew frequented, loved mini-holidays out of town. He also traveled frequently to Canada to work on projects at home, which left her plenty of time to network at the industry parties and events he shied away from. It didn't take long for Francine to fall completely in love. There was nothing to be cynical about in those days. He wasn't pressuring her to be anything but herself, and when he finally moved her into an apartment after half a year of dating, she began feeling rather domestic about him. It was the biggest kind of cliché. She was a sucker for romance, and he'd fit the bill. "He was like you," she said to Jonathan, now running her hands over her hair. The gel she'd put in it had dried stiff. Soon it would start flaking. "Years ago, before I came to New York. He wasn't a diplomat, but he was important. A playwright. He'd already moved me into his place before I found out he had a wife back home in Canada." Jonathan stiffened, and she continued, speaking faster than ever. If she didn't get the words out, she'd never have the courage that exhaustion and wine were giving her now. "I was stupid. It got out, and people took his wife's side, and it was bad. The press picked up on it. I'd never heard about it. You wouldn't if you didn't move in those circles. But California was ruined for me. I couldn't get a job anywhere." Faye bit the inside of her cheek to calm the wobbliness of her voice, then continued. "I made myself over completely. I started going by Faye." "Faye isn't your real name." She shook her head. "It's Francine Wells." She cleared her throat. "Odd for an aspiring soap opera star, I know, but it was my grandmother's, and we're close. I fought every suggestion to change it. Ironically enough, that's what I ended up having to do." The name sounded strange on her tongue. After legally changing it and getting all her documents altered, no one called her by it. Not even her parents, who she had wheedled into submission. Francine was the gullible girl she'd left behind with a broken heart in Hollywood. Faye Welland was a force to be reckoned with, a force that couldn't let in love. Until now. Jonathan was silent, and Faye dropped her head again to his shoulder, then let out a sigh when his arms wrapped around her. Speaking the words had shifted something inside her. She'd said them not for herself. She'd dealt with her losses long ago. But for Jonathan. She'd already told him she loved him tonight. She wanted to give him something else, something that would prove it to both of them. She didn't know what would happen after this. Perhaps he was already through with her, but she'd finally spoken, and she knew in an instant that something that had been released. It was as if a load had been lifted from her shoulders. She felt his lips brush warm and soft against the top of her head. Then she closed her eyes. "Rhode Island?" she asked after a beat. Rhode Island. They reached a small house at the end of a hamlet just after 4 a.m., bolstered by the thermos of coffee and bag of food they'd bought at a rest stop along the way. Faye half lulled to sleep by the stress of the evening, and the long ride yawned as Jonathan fumbled for his keys. "I've never seen you follow me so quietly before," he teased. Faye didn't respond. Instead, she rested her forehead on the center of his back, then wrapped her arms around his waist. She held on tightly, thought about how much she loved it. "I'm glad I talked," she said simply. "No matter what happens, what do you think is going to happen?" She didn't answer that question. she was afraid to. Jonathan exhaled, and then, thank God, he turned around, and she was in his arms, and he was kissing her. "I'm so sorry that happened to you," he said tenderly, and that was all it took for her eyes to well up again. This was what had drawn her to Jonathan, his ability to listen. He possessed an empathy that radiated off of him with every word he said. Perhaps on some level, she knew she'd be safe with him. She rose up on her toes, pressed full against him, kissed him, till they both were breathless. Time blurred around the edges and faded into the darkness. She had no idea how long it had been when he pulled back.
"Not here," he said raggedly. "I intend, Faye, to let you rest in a place where you feel safe. We'll stay here as long as it takes." Jonathan was as good as his word.
He hustled her into the little house. It had been left to him by his parents, he said, and he used it when he wanted to be alone. After scarfing down cold burgers and the rest of the coffee, he took her all over the house, and Faye was instantly charmed. It seemed like a playhouse, or a witch's cottage, or something equally foreign, with low ceilings and white moldings and creaking wood floors and whatnots, and little closets and cupboards and hiding places and fireplaces in every room. It looked like it hadn't been renovated since the 1800s. Faye half expected there to be no modern plumbing. Thankfully, there was. The place was charming, though, in its own way, and it suited Jonathan, she thought, warm and familiar and a little old-fashioned, much like he was. After their simple dinner, they retired to the main sitting room. He lit a fire and opened windows to combat the mustiness and put candles in the sconces on the walls, provided her with a large button-down and a pair of loose sweats. They did not talk much. Faye, curled up by the fire, watched him. He brought in tea afterward and a pack of gingerbread and drew the curtains back in the main window.
"It's almost dawn,"
he said, and peered out.
"The light on the water is absolutely beautiful."
Faye sighed, and Jonathan joined her on the floor, drew her into his arms. His fingers toyed with the stiffness of her hair, and the smudge of gray in the window grew brighter.
"I love you,"
he said simply.
"I've loved you since I met you, but I didn't think you trusted me until tonight, and I'm glad you do."
"Oh, Christ, I don't want to cry anymore," Faye muttered, and he began to laugh, a low rumble deep in his chest. After a moment, she took a breath and spoke. "What next?"
"What's next,"
he said,
"is that we'll stay here for a couple of days, get some groceries, get some exercise on that big bed of mine upstairs. We'll sleep, watch movies, get bitten by all those damned mosquitoes. When we go home, we'll decide what we want to say, and the world will move on. I promise it will, Faye."
Overwhelmed, she nodded and tilted her head up, searching for his lips with hers. He placed a finger on it, shook his head.
"Our life,"
he said quietly, "can be whatever you want it, and I love you, but I can't go on like this anymore. It isn't fair to either of us." A lump rose in her throat. "I know."
"That's all I'm saying on that we're here to enjoy the weekend."
He smiled a little wanly.
"We'll sort the rest out when we get back home."
For the next 3 days, 3 days was all she agreed to take off of work. Faye experienced a side of him she wasn't privy to when he was in working mode in the city. She supposed she looked different to him, too. Daylight revealed the house to be a wisteria-shrouded little cottage at the edge of the sea, with flowers that still retained their scent, although the season had killed off the buds and dried them out. He and Faye took long walks on the shore, watching as the waves lapped over the rocks. He pointed out local flora and fauna to her with a gravity that would not allow her to laugh, although she really wanted to do so. At night, he lit a fire, and they ate whatever they could scavenge from a convenience store several blocks away, with ruinous prices on everything. They kissed, and after dark, she watched the gold-tinged flame play over his skin once they lay spent on the rug in a mess of tangled limbs. Faye did not speak much, but she thought and thought hard. Here, stripped down to the elemental things, her life at home seemed suddenly very barren and as superficial as the lives she curated for her clients. Faye had always been one to chase the glittering, sparkling things that were just out of reach. Had she somehow missed out on true substance in the process? On the last night, Faye and Jonathan sat cross-legged on the rug in front of the fire, eating up the last of the perishable food, both trying hard not to think about their return back to the city. Faye chewed her lip and stared deep into the flames until Jonathan waved a half-finished tub of cold chicken salad under her nose to catch her attention. "Scoop of chicken for your thoughts," he said, widening his eyes at her, and Faye felt unexpected tears well up in her throat. She launched herself at him, inhaled his grunt of surprise with a hard kiss, and could not stop tears from trickling down her face, even when he sat up and tugged her into his lap. "I'm sorry," she said when he demanded gently to know what was wrong. "I've been an absolutely self-centered, callous bitch. You were scared, and for good reason," Jonathan said quietly, and he stroked her hair. Faye shook her head. "Scared and stubborn? You're a good man, Jonathan, and you make me feel..." Oh, this was dreadful, but Faye now knew it was worth the discomfort, the embarrassment, the pain of relived memories. She inhaled and forced herself to speak slowly, steadily. "I'm terrified," she admitted. "But I think about you all the time, Jonathan. When I'm at work, when we're together, when we're not. I can't picture you not being here, but I know life is going to screw it up. It always does." Her words hung low in the air, and Jonathan lifted a hand as if to dissipate them, then placed it back on her head. "I don't know how to do this," she choked out, "but I want to. Please be patient with me." "I don't need to be," Jonathan said after a moment, and his voice was a low rumble in his chest. "This is you. We're on a journey, honey. And I wouldn't skip a single step, because we're on it together." There was more Faye could say about what would happen when they got back to the city, about the terror that still licked beneath her consciousness, about the fact that deep down inside, she wondered if her heart had become too flawed to sustain anything lasting. "Love will grow if you let it," Jonathan said finally. "It will grow and swell and eventually push out the fear that's there. But you have to trust me, Faye. And above everything else, trust yourself." She nodded without speaking. She'd already cried more over the past few days than she had in the past 10 years, and her head ached. She nestled close to his side, stretched up and kissed him on the cheek, then closed her eyes, forcing her breaths to temper to slow. She needed sleep, and tomorrow they'd go home. She didn't know what it would look like, and she forced herself not to think about it, that she thought would have to come later. But she would do one thing for Jonathan and for herself. "Get rid of Amelia," she said softly. "Please." His arms tightened around her. "Amelia should never have happened," he said, and his voice was rough with regret. "Faye, I'm so sorry." She shook her head. "I drove you to it." "No." There was anger in his voice, but it was directed at himself, not at her. "It was me being resentful. If I'd had any idea..." His voice trailed off, and they sat in silence for a moment. Then Faye half turned so that she could look into his face. "Maybe," she said, "we can consider this a new beginning." He swallowed hard. "I'd like that. But Faye..." She knew instinctively what he wanted to ask. "However this turns out," she said, and she snaked her hand down to grip his. "I'm here, Jonathan. I'm tired of running." The return to the city was a bit of a shock in many ways. True to her word, Faye walked hand in hand with him from the car to her front door and stood and lifted her face to his, kissing him for the first time ever in the full blaze of New York City sunshine. "Not bad, eh?" Jonathan teased when they came up for air and she had to smile. Faye returned to her laptop with trepidation on the first day back, activating her Google notifications, checking her email and text messages. She stared at the little numbers on the screen without actually opening them, then called Jonathan from where he labored over the coffee machine, brewing himself a cup before headed back to his own place. "What?" he said, setting down a steaming mug for her, as well as himself. Faye chewed her lip. "I know this sounds silly," she announced, "but I'm going to check my messages, and I want you to be here while I do it." Jonathan's eyes darkened with concern. "Faye, this changes nothing, she trailed off. "I want you to be here, if that's okay." "That's definitely okay," he replied, and the gentle intensity in his face warmed her skin, made her think that whatever happened might not be so bad after all. Even if she lost everything a second time, she still had Jonathan. And that was beginning to feel more important than anything else. "I'm going to read them out loud to you. All of them?" she added, peering at him over the top of her screen. "Go for it, honey." There was a mention in page 6 and several semi-hysterical text messages from Amani, of course, but she was surprised at the narrative. Amelia's statement had seemed to kill any measure of salaciousness to the story. Most news outlets only reacted with curiosity. Jonathan's reputation as a gentleman who kept his love life strictly under wraps had suddenly become far more interesting. There was none of the scandal, none of the notoriety Faye was so afraid of. She'd faced the worst thing that she thought could happen to her, and it had gotten her nothing except the realization that perhaps she'd been clinging so hard to the trauma of the past that she'd been unable to open her arms and embrace the future. The future was Jonathan and her, and the life they would build together. And suddenly, Faye found her heart so full for the first time in years she didn't quite know what to do with the excess. "Are you going to cry?" Jonathan asked, peering into her face as she closed her laptop. "If you are, it's okay." "No, I've done enough of that this weekend," she said, laughing a little shakily. She stood and walked over to him, wrapped her arms around his shoulders. She was dizzy with relief, but there was something else attached to it too, a feeling of hope, of release, of knowing that she'd faced the thing that scared her the most and conquered it. She hadn't just found love. She'd triumphed, and she'd never felt more fortunate in her life. She lifted her chin, kissed Jonathan on the cheek, where that weekend's stubble still stood out in sharp relief on his jaw. "Are you all right?" "More than I've been in a long while," she said softly. "I'm going to take the day off." His brows lifted. Yes." Laughter crept into her voice. "I feel like celebrating. I'm going to treat myself to a spa day. And afterward, you're taking me out to dinner somewhere nice and public. And we're going to Prospect Park and having ice cream and doing all of those ridiculous things I make my clients do." He peered into her face in mock shock. "When did you replace Faye Welland?" "Don't push it." She laughed out loud, released him. "Go to work. I'll see you later." Things she thought as she heard him humming in the shower would be different now. Dating Jonathan, eating with him at the city's toniest restaurants, and attending the theater, and kissing him on strolls through the city streets, and attending events with him. The possibilities were endless. She was well on the way to becoming the walking cliché of a woman in love in New York City, and she liked it. Jonathan was hers, and love, in all its all-encompassing warmth, had pushed out the fear of the past. It was miraculous. It was wonderful. And Faye, queen of the facade, had at last found something real